All right, pretty creepy, but I wanted to start this video this way because there are animals that sense their worlds in pulses, and the rate of those pulses has a huge effect on how much information they get. When the pulse rate goes up, they get more and more information, and at very high pulse rates, it's almost the same as our own visual systems. Well, hey everyone, I'm Ken Catania. I work at Vanderbilt University, and this movie is a companion to my recent book on the art and craft of doing science. And the phenomenon I just described of sensing your world in pulses is probably most familiar to us in echolocating bats that are out flying around giving off echolocation calls at different rates as they probe their world with ultrasound. The way that bats do that was a big clue to a discovery that I'm going to describe in electric eels. But before I get there, I want to tell you about the more familiar world of the auditory system of bats. And for that, I like to show rather than just tell. So I went out to a local park with a bat detector, and I found some bats. This is a rubber bat. And I made some recordings of bats flying around giving off their echolocation calls so I could show you how the rate of their echolocation calls changes depending on the difficulty of the task at hand. I'm going to start this movie with the sound off because that's what it would normally be like if you were just standing in a park. And then I'll turn on the sound, and that is the result of me translating the ultrasound into a lower frequency so that it can play into the camera and you can hear it. One thing that video demonstrates is how very noisy bats actually are. It's just that we can't normally hear their ultrasound. The other thing you may have noticed is that there were these occasional zip-like sounds, and that is called the feeding buzz. That is when a bat is homing in on an insect. And in case you didn't hear those in the full-speed video, I'm going to play one for you now in slow motion. So there you could really hear it, that zzz at the end as the bat increased its echolocation pulse rate. And that is kind of the acoustic equivalent of me turning up the strobe light so that you get maximum information in the strobe light case with vision, and I look continuously illuminated. That's sort of what the bat is doing with echolocation as it homes in on the insect, and that's why it's called the feeding buzz. So now I want to turn back to electric eels. You've already heard a little bit about them with the arm experiment. But now I want to talk about some basics about what we think happened in terms of their evolution and what we know about their sensory systems. So people knew about electric eels for centuries. Darwin pondered what's going on with this animal. How could it possibly have evolved this strong electric output when there isn't any obvious function for a tiny electric organ that couldn't hurt anything? Well, it was known that there were tiny electric organs in these other fish in South America and Africa. And in the 1950s, it was discovered that those small electric organs in these small electric fish are being used as part of a sensory system. So weakly electric fish use electricity, kind of like a radar system, to probe the surroundings of their environment, usually at night, as a way to navigate and find food and often to communicate as well. So if you look at the diagram below, this low voltage sensory system, a lot of these fish are giving off pulses of electricity. So remember the analogy with bats. And from that starting point, it's pretty clear that's where we get the electric eel and its huge electric organ that is being used as a weapon. So this high voltage output has been known to be a weapon for, as I said, centuries. Anyone who encountered an electric eel would know that was the case. But of course, it can also use this weapon to get a fairly easy meal by stunning prey. Now, it might not surprise you to know that given the sort of great functionality of this weak electric organ and the corresponding sort of sensory system that goes with it, that as electric eels evolved their weaponized giant electric organ for its strong output, they also retained the ability to give off these weak electric pulses, so they retained the sensory system function of having a weak output as well. So what that means is, in terms of just the electric eel, you can kind of think of it as having two power settings: a weak output that it uses for a sensory system and a strong output that it uses as a weapon. At least that's where things stood until 2015, when I made a really unexpected discovery. But before I get to that, I want to show you what the electric eels are doing. And it's a lot easier for me to do that with eels than with bats. For bats, I had to use an ultrasound translator. For electric eels, all you have to do is take a speaker and dangle some of the wires from the speaker into the aquarium, and you can basically listen into the electricity that they're giving off. So I'm going to show you that next for both the low voltage output, that's their sensory system, and the high voltage output, that's their weapon. Hopefully that gives you a feel for what's going on with electric eels as they explore their environment with those low voltage sensory pulses, or use their high voltage perhaps to defend themselves or to stun prey, as you saw for that fish. Now I want to stick for a moment with the dichotomy between the sensory component that's low voltage and the weapon component that's high voltage, because that was the story of electric eels for quite some time. But there's more to the story. What if the high voltage, in addition to being a weapon, is also part of their sensory system? Now this is something that was never really considered, partly because the high voltage was explained hundreds of years ago as a weapon, and it definitely is a weapon. There didn't seem to be much more to explain about the high voltage component of the electric eel's output. But there's another reason as well. When an animal gives off a really powerful self-generated signal, movement, sound, those kinds of things, there's often the need for that animal to suppress its sensory system at that moment, so it doesn't sort of overwhelm its own sensors. This is known to happen with bats that reduce the sensitivity of their auditory system, of their ears, when they are giving off their very loud echolocation call, and then sort of raise the sensitivity back up as they listen for the echo. Another example is when we move our eyes back and forth, we cancel out those signals from our retina so that you don't perceive the visual world streaming by in a blur. So if you go to a mirror and move your eyes back and forth, you can demonstrate this for yourself. You'll never see your eyes move. But if you set up your phone camera so that you can see your eyes move back and forth, the slight delay will allow you to see those eye movements. And it would definitely seem that when an electric eel is giving off hundreds of volts of electricity, that's the time it would need to tune down its own sensors, turn off its electrical radar system. The problem is that's a bit of a trap. It's a trap because that makes sense to us, but we don't know if it makes sense to the electric eel. So how do you ask the electric eel that question? Or put another way, how do you do an experiment that tests whether or not the electric eel is using its high voltage not only as a weapon, but simultaneously as part of its sensory system? And to do that, I have to tell you a little bit about what they're most interested in, and that is conductors. So the fish that you saw that electric eel go after is a conductor. So eels are very interested in conductors, and I have here a carbon rod, which is a conductor, and electric eels will definitely attack carbon in the water as if it is prey. And so that provides the opportunity to design an experiment to see whether an electric eel will chase and attack a piece of carbon conductor when it's giving off its high voltage. So what you see here is a disc, and this disc contains mostly non-conductors as sort of a visual control here, and one conductor. And this disc, I'm going to show you this disc spinning while in the eel's aquarium, while recording the high voltage, and I'll let you see what the electric eel is capable of doing. So that was super, super fast, but don't worry, now I'm going to show it to you in slow motion. When you see the screen flash green, that corresponds to the eel's low voltage output, and it clearly detected the oncoming disc using that. And then the red flashes correspond to the high voltage, during which the eel could accurately track and strike at that small moving disc. Well, I find that video to be amazing because that electric eel could track a small moving conductor on a curved path using its high voltage better than I could track that conductor with my own eyes. It's one of the best examples that we have of an animal using active electroreception or an electric organ to probe its environment and track things and identify things. And it's doing it with the high voltage, something that wasn't even thought to be possible for an electric eel. So there's a lot of lessons there, though I do want to point out there's a lot more data and a lot more examples in the published paper, and I'm putting a link to that in the description below. So one thing you might be thinking is, well, why would the electric eel be so excited to track that small disc? It doesn't really seem like a fish. And the best example of a sort of parallel that I'm going to give is if I take this laser pointer and shine it on the board back there, that is a cat's favorite thing to chase around, and it doesn't look anything like a bird or a mouse. So there's some stimuli that really just imitate things closely enough or have some certain features that really attract, for example, a predator to chase it around. The other thing that I want to mention is that this trait, this high voltage, is amazing in having these very dichotomous different functions. It is very definitely a weapon, and there's a lot more details about how it uses, how an electric eel uses electricity, high voltage, as a weapon, but it's also part of a sensory system at the same time. And those are very different functions sort of encapsulated in one kind of output. It's almost as if, we had laser vision or something, so you could see something and fry it with your own visual system. And then there are always those surprising connections. So if you think back to what's happening with bats, when the bat is closing in on the target, its echolocation pulse rate goes way up. The electric eel does exactly the same thing when it gives off its high voltage output. It's increasing the rate of those electrical pulses right when it needs the most sensory information about its target. So there's all kinds of great lessons here, both in the biology of these animals and in how things unfold in science. And until next time, I'll leave you with a few more images of electric eels.